Hello. Welcome to another episode of Environmental Justice Now. I'm Rosina Snow, the Director of Communications here at Virginia Interfaith Power and Light. And today we are joined by Madison Mayhew, who is the Federal Policy Manager for Interfaith Power and Light National, which is in DC, and sort of joins together the many effective chapters of IPL across the country, including Virginia. So Madison has stopped by to talk today about a big issue that may be starting to become more and more present in people's conscious, which is American democracy in 2024. Big topic. What are the stakes for environmental justice and other issues as big elections loom? Before we start today, I'd like to do a brief land acknowledgement. We want to remind ourselves that we gather on the unceded land of the indigenous peoples. I am currently in Charlottesville, Virginia, which is Monacan land. If you are unsure whose land you are on and want to find out, you can visit native-land.ca to find out. So, back to our topic. And Madison, I'd like to give you a big welcome. Thank you for coming by today. And we here at Virginia IPL, we're about to launch our civic engagement campaign for the year. So in Virginia, there is an election every year. So we always do some civic engagement work, and that involves reaching out to folks, doing some phone banking. There's lots of ways to volunteer, and also just educating folks about the stakes at a time when there is so much at stake. Environment and climate can get lost in the mix, but certainly big implications for that, and we'll get to that. But we're also just going to talk a little more broadly about democracy, because we can't really affect any of the change we need to do, including climate action on the timeline. We're talking about if our democracy is not in good working order. So Madison, I will just give her a little bit more of an introduction. Madison supports the Interfaith Power and Light's advocacy work in Washington, D.C. as a federal policy manager. Madison joined IPL after working with the United Church of Christ in their policy office, where she learned about the power of faith-based organizing and the value of moral imagination in addressing the climate crisis. Certainly something that is needed in this work. So again, welcome, Madison. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much for having me.
Of course. So we're going to talk about some of the challenges and the opportunities when it comes to our democratic process and access to democracy here in the United States. And then we're going to talk about some of the stakes of the upcoming election. So we're going to break things down a little bit, and we're going to come at a few of the big issues, the big challenges, and talk about what the problem is and then what the solution is. So Madison, would you be able to talk about some of the current attacks on democracy, the current challenges that our democratic system is facing, as well as how those attacks can be repelled, or how we can solve those problems?
Yeah, thanks so much, Rosina, for having me to talk about this particularly timely, although weighty topic as we head into the election season. I guess we're already in full force of the election season, but really important to discuss some of what we're up against. And if I may, I just want to take a couple of steps back and look at some key Supreme Court cases from the early 2010s that help kind of lay the foundation for the threats that we're up against at this current moment. The first is the Citizens United case from 2010. I'm sure a lot of folks are very familiar with this case. This is the case that gave corporations the ability to spend whatever they want in the election cycle, and ultimately equated corporations with giving them the same rights as individuals. And as a result, we saw quite an influx of corporate money being poured into the election process, influencing decision makers, folks running for office, even some ballot initiatives. And when thinking about our work and this decision relevant to the spaces that we're working around in relationship to environmental justice, it's important to realize that this had a huge impact on the fossil fuel industry being able to influence our election cycle. We saw $1.6 billion in campaign contributions from the energy sector since the decision, including a record $220 million during the 2020 cycle. And additionally, oil and gas companies accounted for over half of the corporate contributions to outside groups of over $1 million during the 2020 cycle. With all of this money going towards super PACs and dark money, going and influencing the election process. The second case I want to highlight is the Shelby v. Holder case from 2013.
I just wanted to pause there for a second, because I think when I, as you said, and when people talk about this, that corporations were given the same rights as individuals, but they really were given more rights than individuals because most individuals don't have billions of dollars to spend.
Absolutely. That's such a good point to make. And there's such a power imbalance there. And so thank you for highlighting that.
Yeah. So the next one is
Shelby v. Holder. It attacked the Voting Rights Act of 1965, a key piece of legislation from the civil rights movement that ultimately included provisions to protect American citizens' right to vote based on race. And in 2013, in this case, the Supreme Court stripped away a key provision called Section 4, which ultimately prevented discrimination. This section called for states to uphold a particular process if they wanted to propose changes in their election policy. It had to be vetted by the federal government. So once that was removed, any discrimination around voting or voting rights protections particularly had now had to be proven by the individuals who were impacted. And so we saw an influx of states implementing really harmful policies like photo ID laws, which specifically suppress voters who are disabled, who are elderly, a lot of communities of color. Also, we saw an increase of purging voters from rolls. And even strong impacts on redistricting. So really, really strong negative ramifications from removing this small piece of, or I guess large piece of the Voting Rights Act of 1965, ultimately gutting that piece of legislation from that really momentous time of history.
Mm-hmm. So my husband is a voting rights litigator. He's talked about this. In fact, some of these decisions are the reason he decided he had to go to law. But yeah, I think the way he's described the Shelby is that previously, when this was intact in that Voting Rights Act, these violations of voting rights would not even be brought to litigate because they would immediately be struck down. And now any violation has to go to court. There's a huge expenditure now of energy and money and time to have to litigate individually these claims, whereas before they just would have been they wouldn't have gone to court. They just would have been struck down, and then not all of them are guaranteed to even prevail anymore. So it's both of those, right? Is that correct?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I appreciate breaking it down in that way because I think it's really important to recognize the impact that this now has on individuals, and the lengthy process it can now take to ensure that if there is voter discrimination, that it is addressed properly in the court of law. But there aren't those same protections that were in place with the Voting Rights Act no longer are there. So it's an arduous process and an ongoing process to ensure that voters are protected across the spectrum.
Right. Thank you.
Yeah. And something else I wanted to talk about that I don't think is as well known is a strategy called strategic lawsuits against public participation, SLAPS for short. I recently in my role have learned about this over the past year. But these are lawsuits often used by powerful entities to silence critics through costly, lengthy, and often meritless litigation. The aim of these cases is to tie up their targets in court until they sign away their First Amendment rights. And we've seen the fossil fuel industry use this tactic for decades by abusing the legal system, by deploying costly, protracted, and meritless lawsuits to target activists, nonprofits, and other organizations exercising their First Amendment rights. And I wanted to bring this up because I think when we think about a functioning, healthy democracy, that includes public participation and opportunities to protest and dissent, policies that are harmful, systems of oppression, and in different forms. And by attacking or by pursuing slaps, the fossil fuel industry and other powerful entities are really harming some of those key outlets that allow for democracy to thrive and be healthy. And is something that we've actually seen some of our partners in the climate space. Currently, Greenpeace is undergoing a lawsuit with a SLAP lawsuit. I won't go into the details, so I would butcher the scenario, but I think it's really important to talk about because it's a tactic being used more and more.
Mm-hmm. Right, and Greenpeace has some resources.
Mm-hmm.
Many people just don't. Right.
Exactly. And when these are just a small portion of some of the issues that we're seeing threaten our democracy. And I know we could probably spend a lot more time talking about all of the various factors at play, but I think it's as we think about solutions and understanding that these issues are really big, it calls for really big ideas and solutions to address them. And there are a few pieces of legislation that help address some of these gaps. The first two that I wanted to talk about are the John R. Lewis Voting Rights Act and the Freedom to Vote Act. These two together update that missing, the gaps now removed in the Voting Rights Act of 1965, helps expand anti-discrimination policy. And the Freedom to Vote Act expands voter access, making it more accessible for folks to vote, while also addressing some of the dark money in our election cycle by encouraging or by requiring the disclosure of certain amounts of funds spent in the election cycle. And as I mentioned earlier, we talked a little bit about redistricting, but not necessarily about gerrymandering, which is a whole other issue that threatens a healthy functioning democracy. And this particular bill addresses some of those issues as well.
Okay. And that was introduced in 2019, right?
Yes, I believe so. And it's been the another issue that I want to talk about eventually was so both of these bills almost passed in early 2021. They made it to the Senate. They passed the House. They were on their way to the Senate. At that moment in time, we had a Democratic trifecta but a very small majority in the Senate. And there was a short window of time to pass this meaningful legislation. And at the very last minute, there was a filibuster preventing these bills from being made into law. And so the fight to pass these are ongoing, and something to keep the drumbeat on for.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and the filibuster, really, there'd have to be some change to the rules around that, probably, for anything big to pass.
Totally. Yeah, for sure. I also wanted to just take a minute to talk about the Supreme Court and why it, as it's currently functioning, that it is also a threat to our democracy. For folks who may not be tracking the Supreme Court justices closely, it's important to recognize that the majority, so 5 out of 9 justices, were appointed to the Supreme Court by presidents who lost the popular vote. And the majority of justices were confirmed by senators representing less of the country's population and who had received fewer cumulative votes than those who had opposed the nomination. So when we think about a democracy fully representing the American public, we see the Supreme Court, the highest court in the land, not reflective of those values. Additionally, in the news, folks have probably seen in the past several months, some of our Supreme Court justices have gotten in a sticky situation by accepting large amounts of money and gifts from billionaires with private interests. And they're allowed to do so because there's no ethical code for the Supreme Court. They are required to report these gifts, but they are not held to the same standard as some of the lower court judges are. And so we need to implement better protection or better standards for and ethics for our Supreme Court justices to be upheld to ensure that the highest court in our land is strong and reflective of the democratic process.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's certainly not a good feeling to know that there's some small group of people, essentially in to large measure, governing us, who are not there because of the will of the people, and are not only is it not possible to hold them accountable, but they are abusing the trust, and it weakens people's faith in institutions. Certainly, it starts to wear down folks' will to make change. It's something that's going to need to change. Like, we can't go on like this forever, and it can't keep getting worse. Something's going to have to shift.
For sure.
And I think the more that consensus builds, the more of a chance there is that may come to pass.
Absolutely.
Yeah, thank you for pointing that out. Sometimes people don't want to be very polite about, we don't want to say anything negative about the Supreme Court or this person or that person, but you have to call it out. You have to be honest.
Yeah, when our systems aren't working in the way that they were intended to, or are really upholding unjust and unethical practices, I think it's really important to call into question what needs to be done to address these issues, and how can we make sure that it's reflective of the values that we hold as a country.
Yeah, thanks. So we've heard about some of these massive problems with the Supreme Court, just that structurally, and also the harm that they've been doing to our democratic process. So, and we've talked about some of the solutions, like the Voting Rights Act. Is there anything else, any other way that people can? I mean, I think we need to know that these judges are appointed by who's elected. Like, Supreme Court justices are appointed by who gets elected president. I feel like this is a dot that does not get connected. Like, a decision came down while this person was president that I don't like, so I'm blaming the president. No, we need to connect the dots that the president and the Senate are who appoints these judges, not just the Supreme Court judges, but many, many other judges. And not even at the federal level, but at the state level too.
Totally.
And sometimes judges are elected, but sometimes they're appointed.
Right.
And, like, the number of outcomes that just that influences is something that should really sharpen and clarify our understanding of, not all candidates are the same. It's not just that there are vast differences in the outcomes that you get.
Right. And I think it's important to remember that federal judges are appointed for life. And so who we either elect as president, who nominates these folks into position, but also the senators who vote to confirm these positions, is really important to take into consideration, because we've seen, there are folks who have been put into positions that did not have the experience that I felt comfortable with being a lifetime federal judge appointment. But I think, yeah, folks, it's important to connect those dots because the president nominates these folks, but it's the Senate who ultimately confirms. And even the Supreme, although we don't have say over who is the Senate Majority Leader, they're often also the ones who either push a vote forward or uphold it, like we saw with the Merrick Garland nomination back in 2015. I think that was.
No, it was 2016. Because didn't Scalia die in the spring? Like
Yeah.
during.
Yes, you're right. You're right. You're right. Yes. And Mitch McConnell, was a significant roadblock from allowing that vote to even to occur, and which led to a more conservative justice replacing him. And I think there's a lot of value in recognizing that judges play such a vital role in the policy that affects everyday Americans. And it's not just the Supreme Court, but our federal circuit courts and appellate courts also.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Mitch McConnell also called the John Lewis Voting Rights Act a power grab.
Mm-hmm.
There's another set of dots we can connect, that if you're seeing something that makes access to democracy or removes barriers to access from democracy and makes things fairer is a
Mm-hmm.
power grab, what does that say about the way in which you're obtaining power? I don't know. I will always remember that he said that.
Yeah, definitely.
So we were also going to talk some about dark money and fossil fuel influence, which unfortunately is folded into the Supreme Court discussion as well.
Mm-hmm.
But is there anything in those categories that you want to expand on?
Definitely could, but I'm also mindful. I know there's a lot of legislation. There's the Disclose Act that's been introduced by oh, I should have written this down, Senator Whitehouse, that calls for a more transparency around campaign finance. And there's also, when talking about the Supreme Court, there's some folks who are calling for the expansion of the Supreme Court to help balance out some of the power, which, as I have learned about this issue, it has actually, the number of Supreme Court justices has actually changed over time, and so it has been done before. And there's a bill that would expand the Supreme Court, but also require term limits for Supreme Court justices to really help balance the power in play within the Supreme Court in this current moment, and address some of the concerns that we have around that issue as well.
Yeah, let these people retire.
Yeah.
Don't need to have a 92-year-old justice clinging on to life. Just give them a few years to enjoy their life's work.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that's obviously not the main concern, but the main concern is to make things fairer and work better. But
yes, definitely.
Yeah, no offense to people in their 90s.
We're not ageist here.
Doing his 6 miles a day, he's doing great. So
Mm-hmm.
he'll be with us for a long time, I'm sure.
Amazing.
Yeah. So, yeah, and I am also a little mindful of the time, because usually we try to keep these discussions under 40 minutes. So, would you talk a bit about the stake in the upcoming election cycle regarding democracy?
Yeah, I think there's a lot we could explore here, and I think for the sake of keeping it C3, I'm going to keep it short or shortish and more broad. But I think, as we've seen with over the past couple of years, I think ultimately we would keep seeing more attacks on voting rights, attacks on accessibility for voting. There's so much, so much rhetoric around increasing voter ID laws, making it removing voting, or it putting in place barriers for immigrants who are voting, ensuring doing all kinds of shady shenanigans to prevent everyday people from being able to vote.
And just to clarify, because the immigrants who are citizens,
Mm-hmm.
because it's
Exactly.
misinformation about like, oh, there's tens of thousands of non-citizens who are voting, and it's just a complete lie.
Right. And I think there's also, this with, as we've aged in technology, there's a lot of concern around the use of AI in this election and promoting a lot of misinformation, particularly, promoting just complete um, lies around who is, either voting twice or voting on the case of their deceased family member, or voting if they don't have, the correct voter ID, which has been proven over and over and over again to be false. And if there are cases that lie within that sphere, they're so small, they're like statistically insignificant to the overall election counts.
Yeah.
And I think, as we talked about a little bit already, but I think what I've been thinking about is, if, depending on how the election outcomes occur and what ends up happening, I could see the filibuster continue to be used as a tool to prevent civil rights legislation, voting rights legislation, really meaningful bills that could have huge impacts on communities across the country, just being stopped in its place because of this system.
Mm-hmm.
And it's concerning to think about what types of tools and what types of strategies folks will use to threaten the systems that ultimately protect voters.
Yeah. And also on the climate,
Yes.
I was recently listening to, I think it was a discussion with a climate reporter named David Roberts, but the Supreme Court has essentially, prevented the EPA from enforcing the Clean Air Act, or taking climate action on the grounds of the Clean Air Act.
Mm-hmm.
Said that it has to be passed through legislation, right? So
Mm-hmm.
some of the greatest tools that we could use to start really slashing emissions and curbing the worst effects of climate change is also going to be through landmark legislation that would
Totally.
to be passed through with the filibuster, because you can't do everything through the budget. You can do a
Right.
lot, as we learned. Inflation reduction that was very helpful,
Mm-hmm.
um, but that's another reason. Yeah.
Yeah, for sure. And thinking about, I know I've been talking about the Supreme Court a lot, but I think there have been a lot of recent relevant cases that particularly highlight what you were just talking about. One is a case that attacks the Chevron doctrine, which ultimately gives agencies the authority and autonomy to define policy where it's ambiguous related to that agency. And we're concerned, there's a lot of concern that SCOTUS is going to overturn this particular doctrine, which then resolves the agency's power to implement policy to the judicial system, and these folks don't have the expertise and knowledge to implement policy and know, particularly around climate science, environmental science. And I say this because we need folks in the administration, whether that be in agencies or otherwise, who understand uh, the programmatic and policy needs of communities on the front lines of climate change. And in order for a lot of these folks to even do their jobs, their budget has to be approved by Congress. And if we have folks in Congress who are attacking climate programs, other environmental justice policies, these folks in the administration are not going to be able to do their jobs in a way that is keeping the community in mind. And so
Mhm.
it's all connected, and I think really important to be able to connect those dots.
I really appreciate you saying that, because there is so much like what you just described. There's certainly what you just described, but there's so many things like that that have a huge impact that people are just not paying attention to, because it's not it's not something you can necessarily get across in one sentence. It's not going viral on social media. It's not the biggest, brightest, most loud thing that people are paying attention to. So when people are making decisions, I hope that they are, or I hope that we can encourage them to expand their scope of attention, which is difficult for us to do as humans. It's not necessarily how our brains are evolved, but we really have to take all of these things into consideration. There are some things even where the thing that's the loudest and noisiest thing, it might be important, but it might actually have way less of a impact than some of these, policy issues.
Yeah, definitely.
And laws, so at being a responsible, I don't want to just say citizen, because it's not just citizens, but like being someone who's responsibly engaging in civic engagement, we have to be able to take all these things into consideration. And we can't let climate and the environment drop down the list of things to pay attention to and care about. And we certainly can't let just the fundamental, like, is our democracy going to be able to function? We cannot let that drop down to anything lower than like number one, really. Because if we don't have that, we can't do anything else.
Exactly.
And we really take so much for granted. We take so much for granted. We really do. I think in the United States, we take a lot for granted that you don't think through, if we didn't have this protection, how much harder would it be to fulfill these other objectives that we have?
Yeah,
we don't
absolutely.
Find out after we've lost it, and we no longer have those rights, and so on. So
yeah, and I think too, there's such a huge access barrier to be able to understand all of these various policies at play. This is my job, so I'm in the weeds, but your everyday person isn't going to be tracking administrative law or what's happening at the Supreme Court. And so I think we have a really valuable role to play to be able to translate what's happening in the federal government so that folks can really be empowered to understand what is at stake and how to take meaningful action.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, the burden can't be placed on people who don't work in nonprofit or in politics or have a weird obsession with that stuff.
Yeah, not everyone is a policy nerd like me, and I have to remember that.
Yeah, good point. So kind of going off of that, maybe, what is a way that those of us who are freakishly interested in following politics or who work in that space, how can we help our friends and neighbors understand the importance of voting with all these things in mind, with the democracy issues in mind, with the impacts on climate environment in mind?
Yeah, I think it really just sums down to voting with our values, which I know is an oversimplification of where we are and all of the things that we are up against. But I really think if we take our faith-based glasses and look at the political situation, the policy situation through a lens of uplifting human dignity, I think that gives us the brain space to really take into consideration a bunch of different factors. As I was preparing for this, I was thinking a lot about, all of the various forces we're up against, all the various candidates, and I think a simple question that I came back to for myself was, are there candidates who will protect our democracy where we can keep pushing for stronger environmental justice protections? Or are there candidates who seek to ultimately dismantle our democracy, harming the process we've made and limiting opportunities for action? And I think as people of faith, I often see us as enablers of imagination. And although there may be candidates that folks aren't super excited about, but may fall within a realm of, of opportunity or possibility to push an environmental justice or climate justice forward. But which candidate will help us build a more just world? Which candidate will help us move forward in our values in a way where we can keep pushing for policy that more positively impacts communities, particularly on the front lines of climate change? And how can we, make sure we're doing our due diligence in that way?
Yeah, and that's really well put. Riddle me this though, because there is framing out there that is saying that voting my values means that I can't vote for someone who is bad on one thing, even if they're going to not be, absolutely terrible on like 100 other things, or if they're going to be, good, or keep that realm of possibility open on all these other issues I care about. I think that there is this sort of like, I don't know if it's a zero sum, but maybe zero sum framing around values, where it's like, well, it would be wrong for me to support someone who is wrong on one issue, but right on other issues. And I think that framing can be very compelling to people, especially when they're in an emotional state where they are upset about something, which is like a good thing that they should be upset about it. But how do we have that not be like the narrative that because practically, that is not going to lead us to down a good road.
Yeah, no, I appreciate you bringing that up in the question, because that resonates with me personally, and I think we're in a space where it is becoming easier and easier to be a single issue voter, and I think people are feeling compelled about particular issues that feel compelling to them in a wide ranging of ways. And I don't know if I have the solution to combat that, but I think something that I am taking into practice is looking at what does the future look like for whichever candidate I'm voting for. Are there issues that I'm not thrilled about in terms of their position, but are there other areas where I could see opportunities to keep pushing against and pushing for stronger policy around that particular issue? Or as a candidate, just would completely destroy those opportunities? And I think it's for myself, I'm having to take a step back and look at the bigger picture, which is
really hard.
Yeah, go ahead.
I was just saying it's really, really hard.
Yeah.
Yeah, it can be really hard.
Yeah, and I am not by any means saying that it is an easy process to do, because I understand there's a lot of I am certainly an empath, and I recognize that there are folks holding a lot of feelings in this particular election, and totally respect that. And I think there's a lot to consider in this process, and I think we have to encourage folks to take that into consideration as well. So I know there's a lot at stake, and these are real humans being impacted, and I don't want to erase the human component of the election either.
Yeah, I really appreciate that. That is a very empathetic take on things. I also, you again bringing up the thread of imagination. That it's a different part of our brain that reacts when confronted with something upsetting. And it's a totally different part of our brain that is able to imagine, and I think taking a few steps back and really imagining what is the world going to look like under these conditions, what is possible to accomplish under these conditions, versus what will be possible under these conditions. What would it feel like if what would it feel like if under these different scenarios? And And I think that engages a part of our brain that is one that we're going to have to be strengthening
Mm-hmm.
in order to really at least get closer to a more just, equitable, fair society.
Definitely. Yeah, I appreciate that like summary back 'cause I think that that's what it boils down to.
Mm-hmm. So I just want to mention that we're going to see you again in July.
Yes.
Madison is going to do a presentation on some of these same topics, but it'll be opened up to whoever wants to join. I actually have a link to it. I'll just put it in the chat, and to the registration for that. That will be virtual, so anyone can join. There will be space for people to also ask questions. Typically there is. But we're going to go a little deeper on this topic, and then we're also going to use that to kind of kick off Virginia IPL's civic engagement campaign for this year. So we're going to start harnessing our collective power that we have here as people of faith in Virginia. And is there anything that you would want to mention about National IPL's work around this that people should know?
Yeah, I appreciate that. I know my colleague who leads the campaign would be upset with me if I didn't, but IPL National has our own civic engagement campaign called Faith Votes, where you can check your voter registration and learn more about the elections happening in your community. And we have a voter reflection guide coming out soon that just serves as a conversation guide to have with folks in your faith community as we approach the elections coming up.
Okay, and I'm just going to show that here on the screen, and I can also put that in the comments and all the places where this video will appear. So thank you. I feel like we covered a lot of ground.
Yes, we did.
So thank you for the deep knowledge that you bring to this, and also your compassion and wisdom around these issues. So
I really appreciate the thoughtful conversation. So thank you for the questions and the space to have this dialogue.
Okay, thanks so much. All right, so have a good weekend, everyone, and we'll see you not next week, but the week after that. We should be coming back for I believe, a Juneteenth centered conversation. So, all right, have a great weekend, everyone. Bye.